Asian Americans are among one of the fastest growing racial groups in the U.S., but some say they are also one of the most economically divided. The community is coming together to demand justice, equity, and inclusion following last week's deadly spa shooting near Atlanta and the increasing attacks against Asian Americans since the start of the pandemic. An article in the New York Times highlights the community's push to be heard. Joining us now to talk more about this is Brian Chen. He is the author of that article and is the lead consumer technology writer for the New York Times. Brian, welcome. Great to have you with us. So you lay out two different groups of Asian Americans by income levels. Walk us through why you say these groups have become isolated from one another and what impact that has on their collective ability to fight against racial injustice.
Sure. I like to say that Asian Americans are a puzzling group. We puzzle others, but we also puzzle ourselves. And that's because the economic divide between us is so wide. In fact, we have the widest income gap in the United States. In 2016, incomes range from $12,000 at the 10th percentile to about $134,000 at the 90th percentile. So that kind of explains why you have people like the leaders of Google and Zoom are Asian Americans who are at the most successful U.S. companies versus the people at the low end of the ladder are Chinese restaurants and spas, which have been extremely hard hit in the pandemic. And this can largely be explained by different waves of immigration. People that came different waves had different skill sets. Those who came around 1965, which was the Immigration and Nationality Act, and 1975, which is the end of the Vietnam War, they tended to have the lower skilled jobs, the service jobs. Those who immigrated in 1990 came under the H-1B visa program. And those were the ones that were they were helping U.S. companies hire foreigners with exceptional skills. So they were recruited under that program. Those people tended to be higher educated and eventually earn higher wage jobs. So that's very broadly speaking, the two different groups.
So these two different sort of visa processes that you sort of touched on there, what roles do these visas play in the kinds of employment that immigrants can generally get, and how they also influence the ways white Americans perhaps view Asian immigrants?
The people at the low end of the ladder tend to have those jobs that we're hearing about, like, say, in Atlanta, the people that work at the spas, the people who are stuck in Chinatown working in the restaurants, the people working the service jobs that make up that low end of the ladder. The people who came under the H-1B visa program tended to work in jobs that were so-called higher skilled, technology, science, math, STEM, as we call it. And those people tended to have higher educations when they immigrated here and were able to raise children with higher incomes. I want to be clear, there's some cross-pollination between the two groups. Some of those in the former camp who came in the earlier waves of immigration eventually raised children who climbed the ladder by getting some of those higher skilled jobs. So it's a very complicated narrative, if you will. And the thing that makes it very hard for the groups to converge when it comes to being active in politics or being heard by, for activists to be heard on certain issues is that the issues are so different depending on which group is speaking. And largely that's resulted in the Asian American community being viewed as invisible by politicians.
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because my next question was about why you believe Asian Americans have been historically treated like an invisible, community by lawmakers. Do you feel that on some level that's sometimes by design? I mean, sometimes you hear that, Asian Americans who are doing so well, you hear that sometimes they like to just stay under the radar.
Right. So it's really difficult for Asian Americans to have their issues heard because, for example, the hate crimes have been skyrocketing over the last year. Activists have been pointing out these issues to lawmakers and government leaders for the longest time. It's been even beyond a year that these issues have existed. They often fall on deaf ears because when people in leadership hear about these issues, they'll point to the top of the ladder and say, look at how well you guys are doing. You're earning so much money. you have elite educations and so on, and they ignore the people who are at the bottom of the ladder. It really, like, people get confused about the identity of the Asian American because it's so complex. As a result, it's treated as mostly an invisible community. You can't really get issues heard on either end of the spectrum.
And is there, within the Asian community, as in so many other communities, including, the Hispanic community, which I, consider myself, a bit of a generational divide in how this is viewed in terms of fighting against, Asian American discrimination?
Oh, there's certainly a generational divide in that those who immigrated during the earlier waves and were working really hard at the low-skilled jobs and trying to make a living for their families, they were just looking out for themselves and not trying so hard to, what's a good way to put this? Let me try to reframe this. It's different between the generations in that those who are more privileged have the luxury to even think about some of these issues. Let me fast forward to modern times. Like currently there's a diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation happening in corporations across America. A lot of people are talking about equity and saying we want to end white supremacy, we want to end white dominance of the office culture. When you look at the divide and looking at the low-skilled workers who work at the spas and nail salons and so on, those are the people who don't even have the luxury to think about that. They are at the whims of their white clientele. So it's really a generational divide in that the two groups have been split like that for generations, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, but do you see some unity going forward? I mean, do you think that there's more consciousness around that now?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people relate with this incident right now, where not only with the shootings last week, but over the past year, seeing the hate crimes rise, seeing photos of Asian elders beaten to a pulp. This is something that people can converge on and agree that I think if you talk to any Asian American right now, it doesn't matter how much money they make, whether they work a white-collar job or a blue-collar job, everybody is scared right now about this idea of entering the public and potentially being attacked because of the way they look. When people go back to work, when remote workers go back to the offices and they get back on the subway, they go, get coffee, they commute to work, they are just going to be as vulnerable as anybody else, largely because of this climate of xenophobia right now.
Well, Brian Chen, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.